Welcome everyone to the International Literature Festival Berlin, the virtual edition here. I'm very happy to be able to talk to Shaun Tan in a second, who is live with us from Australia at this moment. Many things are different this year, as you might know. We have a hybrid festival. Some of the events will be set or take place in Berlin. Some of them will be half in Berlin, and some of the authors will be having a live chat with us here. And like this event now will happen online, but also be streaming at Berlin. It is called What Images Do We Need? And we have illustrator, author, director, and artist Shaun Tan live with us from Australia. I would usually say, please give him a huge round of applause. So maybe you can do that in front of your tablets, your computers, your cell phones. Welcome, Shaun.
Thank you. Great to be able to talk to you.
Yeah. We have two books that we want to talk about, and you in general a little bit. Let me just put it here. One of the books that I fell in love with is the first one we're going to talk about, Cicada auf Deutsch in German, was published by the Aladdin publishing house and translated by, sorry, I have to look this up, Eike Schönfeld. It's a 32-page tale about an animal. We're going to talk about it in greater length, and then the other book we're going to talk about is, of course, Tales from the Inner City, an anthology about, animals that live among us or take up our space in greater cities, so that once were humans. What that is all about and how much the author wants to talk about is left for us to discuss. A few words about Shaun Tan. Shaun Tan was born in Australia and studied English literature and art at the University of Western Australia. I think that is correct. Let me check. Yes. And has been an accomplished author and illustrator for a very long time. He started at a very early age and also published at a very early age, and has been working in films, has been working as an illustrator and author of his own books. Let me just quickly read you the names, starting with The Playground, The Lost Thing, that was then turned into a film by himself also, The Red Tree, The Arrival, Tales from Outer Suburbia, The Bird King and Other Sketches, also Rules of Summer, The Singing Bones, and then Cicada and Tales from the Inner City. I counted more than 30 awards that Shaun Tan was awarded with. Let me just name maybe the biggest ones. One was the Youth Literature Award for Tales from Outer Suburbia, the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award 2011, and for the only film that he made, co-directed by Andrew Rueman, called The Lost Thing, he got no other award than the Academy Award, the Oscar for Best Animated Short Film. Congratulations, and once again, welcome, Shaun Tan.
Thank you. Thanks.
Usually I would expect that we were sitting in front of an audience of younger children, older children, a mixed bag of little ones and older ones discussing your books, and they would possibly want to know how you came to drawing. Now, on your homepage, every possible question that an interviewer could ask you is already answered, and you even have little alien that answer, that anticipate all the questions. So I'm a little bit shy. Just imagine that I'm a little boy and I want to know what it's like to be an illustrator and author and someone who makes films and paints pictures. What kind of advice would you give me? What would you tell me?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is there's not much to tell you at all if you're a child, because you already enjoy drawing and making up stories. I guess the real question is how does that impulse survive all the way into adulthood and become some sort of viable occupation? That's the trick. And I guess for me, it was really just the fact that I was very good at drawing and loved it so much, and it's something that I've always returned to again and again. It's a place of great solace for me. It's a place of private thought, and I'm sure that's true of every other writer and artist. So it begins as a personal project, and you find out over time that other people respond to it, which of course is important because art is about communication. It's not just about being a monk or a hermit, having a conversation with yourself in a small room, although it is that. Um, but having the feedback from friends and family, starting, I remember from about the age of 6, where people would say, "Oh, you're really good at drawing," or "You're great at telling jokes," or making up things. Um, as a kid, you think, "Well, hey, that maybe that is something that I'm good at." And I was a very small child, um, and easily bullied, so I, uh, I leaned on that as a source of strength, growing up, and that could be one reason that I focus so much of my attention on illustration and writing, is because it was something that it gave me a sort of social status as a child. Um, and it was something that pleased other people, but it also pleased myself. So, I was ticking all those boxes. And over my life, I've dabbled with other things. Like I almost thought I'd become a scientist at one point when I was a student, but I always come back to books and stories and painting. It's almost like it's hardwired in me. So, in terms of young people, and I do speak to a lot of, um, when I say a young artist, they're not necessarily a young person. I mean, you could be in your 60s and be a young artist because it's new. But uh, the only advice I would really give is to follow the uniqueness of your passion, or try and identify the thing about yourself that is unique, that's special, and it could be something that you would immediately dismiss, because a lot of people spend time trying to be like others. That's natural. We try to do work that is part of the culture that tells us what is good and what is not. But I've sort of like tried to, over the years, listen to the weird little voice in my head and try to make work out of it, and just trust in that weird little voice.
That's a beautiful answer, and also I think quite encouraging for kids. Well, you talked about bullying a little bit, and like the strength that gave you, or that the strength that art, or like practicing art, can give you. One thing before we talk about Cicada, that I sort of came across, or that struck me, was that I think a lot of those creatures that you create are a little bit eerie, are beautiful, and yet a little bit, as we would say in German, unheimlich, sort of like an outsiderish creature, and in some kind of alien form. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how your books have an appeal, of course, in their form, or your paintings rather, to a younger audience, but there's also something for, well, adults to see in them, and how most of your art, I would say almost all of it, like it appeals to many generations. How difficult that is to produce, or how intentional that was.
Mm. Um, yeah, those are really good questions that I ask myself all the time. um, First of all, there's no real intention as far as an audience goes. So that's the interesting thing to say. I don't write specifically for children. I don't write specifically for adults. If there's anybody I write for, it's for myself, and I guess most writers do in the first instance. And then there's a little consideration for audience, mostly for me, of trying to make sure that the work remains accessible and universal. And so that could be making it so that a story is understandable by a 5-year-old, but it could also be making sure the story would be understandable by someone in Zimbabwe, or someone in Berlin, or someone who's grown up in a place that's very different to my personal experience of both, you know, language, pop culture, all the references that you normally draw on to tell a story. So the creative process for me often starts with something fairly particular, very verbose, often overwrought and overdrawn, and I spend a lot of time carving it back to something very simple and universal. And in the process, the stories do end up, almost by accident, having broad appeal. Um, and most of the time, I'm just trying to be clear. I'm trying to tell the story in a way that is as clear and simple as possible, and elemental, I think, is a good word. and also a little bit weird, so a little bit displaced. So it's not really in this particular time and place. It's in another world that have relevance anywhere. And as a result of that, not only have the books been understood by both children and adults at all levels, but they've been widely translated. And I didn't plan on that, but it's something that I think happened in the pursuit of a very simple universal story. And as for the question about outsiders, maybe that ties in to that issue, because I find it's almost much easier to tell a story about the world if your main character is an outsider or a displaced person. It's almost like it gives you a clearer view of the way things are. When you're inside a system or a culture, it's almost like too close to you. You can't see the forest for the trees. And when you create these sort of weird, they're often like alien-like characters, I guess, that I tend to draw. Um, it's a way for me to be. When I was younger, I used to think of it as like a Martian anthropologist. Like, what would aliens make of our situation and what's going on? And it's that outside point of view that actually is able to shed some light on the things that are otherwise overly familiar, to the point where we don't notice things like injustices or logical discrepancies, or just the basic weirdness of existence, because we get used to this weirdness that's around us. And the only way to almost see it properly is to step back from another point of view. And so for me, I think that's maybe why the outsider characters and the strange humanoid insects and mechanical sentient beings and all this weird stuff seems to emerge from. I don't think about it too much when I'm drawing, but afterwards, I think, well, maybe I'm trying to find that Martian anthropologist.
Let's maybe talk about the Martian that is on the cover of this beautiful book. As always, you already said something clever about it, so I don't need to introduce it. I can only quote you. It's a very simple 32-page picture book about the unspoken horrors of corporate white-collar enslavement. Or is it? You can never tell what a buck is thinking. I was asked specifically by a lot of people from the festival for you to tell me the story of how this book came together. Of course, as a moderator, you don't want to be asked to ask a question, but here I am asking you. When the idea was born and what it might have to do with the International Literature Festival.
Yeah, well, it's funny because the first idea for this book happened a long time ago. I think it was 2008. It was when I was at the Berlin Festival, the only time I've actually been there. And I was in a boat. My memory is very vague. It's terrible. But I was in a boat going down the river, and it was part of a tour of the city organised by the festival for the authors and illustrators, which was fantastic. It was a really great festival, and I really got to know the other creators there, which is a big part of what a festival is for the guests who are invited, is meeting the other guests. And we were joking and having a lot of fun, and I noticed that there was, along the riverbank, there were both these beautiful scenes, but also some really quite brutalist office architecture. And there was one building in particular. I actually really love bleak urban architecture. I'm attracted to it. There was one building which was just this enormous monotonous facade of little square office windows, and they were also regular and grey. And in one particular window, there was a bright red flowering pot plant. And I remember joking to one of the other authors that, oh, that must be where the bug lives. It needs, it just needs that plant to keep it going. And it's one of those throwaway remarks that you usually, you have a laugh and move on. But for some reason, that thought stuck in my head, and that image of the pot plant in the window stayed with me for well over a decade. And I kept coming back to the idea of a big insect working in an office, not wondering what that meant. And increasingly, I thought of it as a cicada, because I've always been fascinated by that particular insect because of its 17-year life cycle. So up to 17 years living in its nymph stage in darkness underground, chewing on tree roots or whatever it's doing. And then in a very short period of time, they all burst out of the ground. There's so many of them in such an unexpected natural cycle that they overwhelm their predators. And a lot of them get devoured. You know, it's a huge feast for all the birds and frogs and so on. But there's so many of them that they're able to mate and survive and lay eggs, which then starts the whole 17-year cycle underground again. And I thought, what a bizarre life plan and so different from the human life plan, and yet somehow kind of familiar when I think about all the stories that I've read or friends I've known who've been very disgruntled with their corporate enslavement and felt I guess a little disappointed upon retirement of they're glad to have retired, but there's also this feeling of, did I waste my life for a corporation that maybe didn't appreciate what I actually did as a human being? So, these ideas, I sat with them for a long time and went through many versions of a complicated story about this downtrodden bug working in an office and eventually retiring. And originally it was a love story between two bugs. And I decided to, as is my way, to simplify it down into something far more basic. And it just became about this one bug liberating itself from an awful situation. So yeah, I owe Berlin this story. Of course, Melbourne has its fair share of brutalist office facades, which are just utterly dehumanizing to look like, but somehow also thrilling to me. I kind of find it fascinating that humans create these aquariums in the sky for themselves. And I think, but my very earliest inkling of the story was, and that's often the case when I'm not thinking about writing or illustrating, I'm just mucking around or, having a silly moment. I think when you're an artist, part of the skill is not even being good at art, it's being able to listen to the thoughts that you would normally censor and throw away, and you return to them and you think, well, why did I think about that? Why was that so interesting? And what can that tell me about some subconscious intelligence that, noticing the pot plant in a window?
It's a very quick read because it has very little text in it, but it's so interesting to go back to the book and read it in different ways. I have a lot of questions about it because there's this beauty in, first of all, I'll show some of the pictures. Well, let's just show the first one maybe. The bleak architecture or the bleakness of images that I can also find in Tales from the Inner City or other works where there are no words and there are almost no living beings in this. The facades, or you seem to be fascinated by the facades or the outward appearance of office buildings, and then there's very little text. And I'm very curious about the construction of this book. You just said there was a different version. I was very curious because I read the German version, what the English version was, and there is a sort of like very little text but broken English in a sense. I was wondering about that. And then I was wondering about the construction of text and image, because I think in The Arrival you have no text at all, so you trust in telling a story without words. Sometimes you use a little bit of words. In the Tales from the Inner City, you sometimes use a few words, sometimes you write long stories. Can you enlighten me a little bit about the process of words versus images or paintings?
Yeah, it's very much an evolutionary process for me. So sometimes the ideas come and it's very clear to me, this is a series of pictures with a few words, or this is a long written story, sometimes unillustrated, it's just a piece of prose. In most cases, though, I try out different ideas in a sketchbook. So I will write versions, I will draw versions. Again, in the pursuit of simplicity, if I can, I will try to remove illustrations or remove text and just see if I can make it work in really basic terms. And The Arrival is one example of that, where the moment I removed the text, I found this felt simple, very disquieting and mysterious, and it felt magical. And that was only as a result of doing those visual experiments that I realized that. So for me, everything very much happens on the sketchbook page in terms of the thought process and the creative process. And it's like a laboratory where you're just running different experiments. And you don't know if they're right or not until you get a strong feeling. You might just have this certain simple image with text, and it's like, that's it, that really works. And in the case of Cicada, writing the language in broken English just was immediately quite logical. Just the idea that if a bug was trying to adapt to a human corporate environment, it might have trouble with the language, but just enough to get its point across. And I guess in the back of my mind, I was thinking about immigrant workers too. And my father was one of those. He worked in an architectural firm, a few different architectural firms for most of his life, and he was a very loyal worker. But his English skills were never 100%, and that could have maybe held him back in some ways. So, and I'm used to growing up in a household where, one of my parents doesn't speak English hugely well, and that I don't speak Chinese, which is his first language. And so I'm always fascinated by the idea of communication through obstacles. And I guess looking back on all my work, almost all of it is about obstructed communication. And as a visual artist, that's an interesting theme, because I'm relying predominantly on visual images to carry meaning. And I see visual images as being very powerful in situations where other channels of communication are difficult. And that could be for all sorts of reasons, whether it's a disability or an inequality, or issues of language or anything. In most cases, just the fact that all of us are disabled when it comes to expressing ourselves. We've got this storm of feelings inside, and it's very difficult to get them out in the way that we want. So for me, sometimes just these very simple, quiet images are the most effective way of communicating things. Not clearly, I'd say, but in a way that's still strong. So in the case of Cicada, I think, it's very interesting in different countries where it's been translated. It's been received in different ways. And that's the beauty of the illustrated book, or art and literature, really. But you really see it come to a head in an illustrated book, is how different people interpret the images. I got a lot of feedback from the United States that this book was really about immigrant workers, and that was interesting because it showed some of the racial and cultural divides, and how that was like an issue at the forefront of people's minds, is this idea of illegal immigrants, in particularly working in jobs where they are somewhat oppressed because of their status, and threatened. They live lives under threat because of their status. And then in Japan, where the book's been recently published, there's just a lot of commentary about how this reflects the lives of, salarymen, or the kind of Japanese men who are very committed to a sort of a strict and disciplined corporate life. And in fact, that has ended up being a huge audience for the book. So not so much children, but as my editor said, middle-aged Japanese businessmen. So which is fantastic. That's what I was kind of hoping for. That people who actually feel a little bit like this insect would be the ones that are inclined to pick up the book and read it and have a think about it. So I'm not sure if I answered all of your questions, but that's it's just really interesting to see how when you simplify a book down, and visually is often a framing thing for me. Like I start off with elaborate pictures, and I crop them and crop them and crop them and crop them, and so in the book you see very oblique views of office buildings, people's heads are cut off. You don't see the other humans. And it's almost like, how close can I get and how simple can I get to minimize the information, and then also give the audience room to build the edges of the world. I want the audience to actually create the world, not for me so much. I just give a few clues.
Adding maybe to what you said, there's a parallel of the cicada and the character of Mr. Hero in the Moonfish episode. I find when it comes to language of tales from the inner city, and I was thinking a lot about, because I think you explicitly said that the arrival is about immigration. I don't want to read into an animal what it might mean, just because I think that that's your intention. But now you said it, the idea of alienness, I think, is also a parallel. When you talk about illegal, you talked about illegal immigrants. I, as a non-native English speaker, was very surprised about the term of illegal aliens when it comes to people. Actually, I never knew that an alien could be a person, and then also seeing that the alien, the out of space sort of like creature, is part of your universe. I found that there are a lot of strings that can be connected, but don't necessarily have to be. Maybe like an intermediate question, like, what do you think about the interpretation of your work? If someone in the United States says this book is about, well, let's say immigration, and the topic of our talk is what images do we need? And I say, oh yeah, we need this image, we need this metaphor that you do. I'm sort of like reducing you to something. I mean, it's fiction and it's fantasy. And what is your reaction as an author, as an artist, to interpretation also in a political sense? Do we need the reading of this text, of this image, of this artwork as, let's say, something urgent and political, or do you just leave all the interpretations there?
Well, I think the latter. I, I tend to be drawn to social and political themes, but it's not intentional, and they just sort of bubble up. I think it's the concerns that you know build up in you, like a compost from reading the news, and general anxiety of the contradictions that we see between realities and what leadership does about it. And just the general contradictions we see in our own lives and our own thoughts. I feel a lot of my work is actually very self-critical. I'm criticizing my own views about things, or my lack of ability to see things, and I'm trying to see further through drawing and painting and storytelling. But I think all of these concerns kind of feed into the images on some level. But then when it comes to the easel and the final text, I'm very concerned to eliminate the specificity of those concerns. So um, the arrival was never a response to the kind of immigration crisis that was happening at the time, especially in Australia. So we have a lot of issues and a very polarized attitude towards immigration, because we are a country of immigrants, but we are also a country that's often fearful of immigrants, and that irony runs deep in our culture, and kind of galvanizes our culture, and creates a lot of art and literature and anxiety. Um, and I think it was interesting because that book was such a long process. So I spent 5 years working on it, and had it been a response to the initial crisis at its conception, it was then a response to the crisis that happened a couple of years later, and the one that happened a couple of years after that, and then many years after publication. Of course, you had this mass migration crisis in Europe. And a lot of people picked up the book again and said, hey, this book is a wonderful response to that issue, but it had been written such a long time ago. So I became aware in my research that these crises, which seem so hot and current, are actually, they're more like a pulse that runs through history at a very deep level, and they're recurring constantly, um, and not necessarily in a good way, but they're always there. So the crises are ongoing, and for that reason, I actually set the book about 100 years ago, instead of setting it, say, in a contemporary environment. I thought I really want to. For me, originally, it was about getting away from the current political climate and being able to look at migration with a broader view and thinking about my own ancestors from about 100 years ago and where did they come from and what might they have experienced. But in doing so, you inevitably, as you try to get that, Martian anthropological distance from a subject, you can't help getting right up close to things that are happening now. It's just unavoidable. But I do try to create work that is resonant in the long term and a test for myself when I create a book, or when I'm reflecting on what I've done and considering editing it, is would this book still be at all relevant in 50 years or 100 years? So that's kind of a little test that I run. And if there's anything in the book that I think that might not read in 100 years, or that might not make sense, I'll do my best to eliminate it or replace it with something that's again simpler and more universal. So I hope that a book like Cicada, for instance, will still, someone in 100 years' time will pick it up and get it, and find that it has some relevance to their actual life that they're living right now, whatever that situation is. Um, and I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb. I have great respect for all those books and movies and paintings that are so fresh now, even though they might have been produced a century ago. I find that's a remarkable achievement if anybody can pull that off, and it's very rare, actually.
The title that this talk was given is what images do we need? What were you thinking when you read that? What do you can you answer that question, or what images do we need? Do we need images? If I look at your art and how it tells stories that might be fictitious, that might resonate with people in different parts of the world, it would be a non-natural image. It would be sort of like a playful image that resonates with realities or with timelessness, as you just said, would be my improvised answer to that. But I'm not the one to answer. What do you think? What is your answer? What images do we need as an illustrator?
It's a really good question. What images do we need? I don't know that many creators are responding directly to that question, but probably indirectly, because why else, would we make this stuff? I think the first thing I would say is we need images that are actually entertaining. And I sort of have a arts degree background, which was very academic, and the word entertaining was not something that you would dare use in the corridors of the particular contemporary art institution where I was studying. But I've come to realize that it's a really undervalued principle in art, is just make the thing damn entertaining, whether it's funny, weird, playful. And I've always been attracted to illustration because it's fun. So my first impulse when I pick up an illustrated book is, or a comic, or watch an animated film, is like, that looks fun. It could be fun in a disturbing way, but there's an element of fun and entertainment there. And I think that is the way in which you access deeper issues. And you kind of don't even have to try to access those deeper issues. So it's not like you're on a mission to change the world by making grand statements about injustice or whatever. But it inevitably comes in the pursuit of fun, strangely. So you start off drawing and writing something, and much like the Cicada story about bug working in an office with a pot plant, isn't that funny? The more you sort of draw it and write to it, the more serious issues start to well up, underneath a fairly facetious surface. And I find that's just a fascinating aspect of the creative process, is you start off unpretentiously, just trying to entertain yourself, and you end up having this fairly deep discourse about, the nature of reality, or the relationship of an individual to society, or pretty much anything. And I like the fact that it doesn't feel forced or constructed or carefully architectured, that it just happens quite naturally in the process of enjoying oneself with words and images. So, um, to answer your question, I think there's a lot of images that we actually need. I think we need, because our world is changing so fast and it's so complex. I feel that the culture is always lagging behind technological advancements and social change. It's like we're racing to catch up. And we do need images that help us to visualize all the things that are going on, because we're affected by these invisible forces. Um, and that's what where visual images can be powerful. They can give us almost like coat hooks on which we can hang our ideas. Even if they're like a political cartoon or something, it's like it'd be a wonderful device for just hanging a set of ideas. Because we're animals, and we're animals that respond to pictures of stuff. Um, and yet we have to live in a world with very elaborate abstract concepts. But how we get to those pictures, well, that's the trick. And but when they work, they're pretty powerful, and we can see how certain images um, have changed the world. You only have to just look at the recent Black Lives Matter movement and realize that that's very much been triggered by a visual image. And the same is true for certain works of art, that they don't have to have such a dramatic or wide impact, but they can certainly work in a very effective way by giving these little coat hooks that people can hang their thoughts on.
I wanted to make build a different bridge to Tales from the Inner City, but now that you talk about it, I have one quote from this book, and it says, "But there's no natural order. It's all luck and absurdity. It's up and down, upside down, the place you were born, the color of your face, the debt you inherit before you're even pushed out." So combining that with what you just said, we're all animals, a little introduction to Tales from the Inner City. It's, as I said, sort of like a collection of short stories that are not necessarily linked, but that all circle around animals. It starts with crocodiles living in a certain floor in an office building. It's about frogs that were once, I think, a businessman. It's about a huge moonfish, and so on and so forth. Maybe we can attempt in the last minutes of our talk to sort of like bring all these subjects together. The quote from the book that is very much about identity, then the idea of our identity being constructed or us being animals, and also a much longer book. I think it's 113 pages with beautiful images, but also more text that goes into different directions than not just the cicada, but different dimension of storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about in a short space of time.
In a few minutes.
But it's also a pretty simple book in many ways. In spite of its length and elaborateness, um, I like the fact that all the stories in there feel to me fairly consistent, and I'm not sure what they're pointing to. And I know a work of art is working when I don't understand it fully, but it still compels me. But I would say that like you say, it's something to do with the fact that we are animals. Humans are animals. We're one species, on a planet with millions and millions of other species. We're not even a very important species in the scheme of things. If we disappeared tomorrow, the natural world would it would notice, but probably in a way that is cause for some rejoicing, which is sad. That's the situation that we find ourselves in. It's also like I find it fascinating, and this whole literature festival, for instance, is a good example. Is it's only ever going to be contributed to by one species' voice. And you were asking earlier, what do we need? Images do we need? And I always think we need images of the things that we can't see or hear, and that's what all writing essentially is about. To me, at least, as a reader, it's about hearing the things that are otherwise inaccessible and those voiceless parts of reality that continuing to exist even when we don't acknowledge them or think about them. And I think that's a thread that runs through all my work, whether it's looking at immigration or colonization, but it sort of leads quite logically to the world of animals, because I feel that animals are sentient beings. You know, they have feelings and thoughts, and increasingly there's been a lot of scientific research, alarmingly only recently actually, but revealing the neurological functions of animals are very, very similar to our own, much more than we originally thought. And I think it's a real shame that, and I count myself as one of the humans that do this, that there's a tendency for humans to ignore that perspective simply because animals are unable to participate in our cultural discourse, at least not directly, only by some kind of human agency. And the fact that, in legal terms, they're regarded as property, like not much different from furniture and tables and chairs. And increasingly, there's a movement in places like Germany, in particular, and other European countries, to recognize animal law. So I was researching all of this stuff and finding such an interesting framework for writing fiction and painting pictures. And as I said, originally it began as a kind of almost a fun, entertaining impulse. You know, what if there were crocodiles living on the 87th floor of an office building? How would people react to that? Or what if there were, you know, fish swimming through the sky? Or you know, what if there were tigers that would regularly appear in crowded streets? And just sort of playing with those ideas in a fun way. But as I did, they revealed just interesting contradictions in the way that we live, and that outsider perspective that I always like to find. I don't think you can get more of an outsider perspective really than from the point of view of animals.
That's beautiful. One idea I had for this talk, and now it seems a little bit ridiculous, was to sort of like insert fictitious children's questions, because usually we would talk in front of an audience of maybe some of the kids, and you can sometimes predict. And it's also always good for someone who is a little bit older to sort of like not have to ask these questions, although you're also interested in. One of the questions would definitely be, how long did it take you to make this book?
That one was surprisingly quick actually. I'm a very slow worker because I change my mind a lot. So I do the books a number of times, and you're seeing one version that actually works. But in the case of Cicada, I think because I've been thinking about it ever since that boat trip in Berlin, which is a long, long time. And I've been sketching it out in my sketchbook too, just different versions. Like this is a really old sketchbook, and you can see, I don't know if that's going to show up, little
Oh, yeah.
drawing of their character just with a biro, and I often work in these kind of little books just with a pen, especially when traveling. And so I'd play the story out in my mind repeatedly, and when it came to, it's probably the fastest book I've ever done actually. It was about 3 months. I kind of just knew how everything looked, and I knew exactly how to organize it. I knew what happened at the end. I knew what happened at the beginning. I knew what the end papers looked like. So there's a unusual situation for me. But that could be one reason also why it's so effective, is because it was produced in a fairly direct and unagonizing way.
You said you hate the word illustrator. At one point I think you say you don't like to be called an illustrator. I had the same sort of like impulse that it's just someone who illustrates something, but actually you're an artist. And when I looked on your homepage, I saw that a lot of those images are actually oil or acrylic on canvas. And maybe going back to that fictitious children's question, I mean, this is not just an illustration, or many of the images are not illustrations made on the computer or quickly drawn like a graphic novel, but they are real paintings. How is the process from from that painting to translating it into a book? And is the book always the idea that you have the form of a book, the place for your paintings, images?
Yeah, that's a good question because the book, it's obviously that's the end artwork is the book, and a lot of trouble goes into getting the reproduction right and things like that, and designing the book. So I like to be involved with all that. So I designed all the aspects of something like Cicada, the title and the fonts and everything. But at the same time, when I'm working at the easel, it's a very direct relationship with a material experience, and I do enjoy the painting for its own sake. So, and my background is as a painter working in traditional media. So, I'm I'm old enough to be a pre-digitally trained artist. So when I was in high school, there just weren't any computers, or there was one in the corner with Corel Draw or something on it, and we all looked at it with some bewilderment. Um, it's amazing how things have advanced now. I think the technology is fantastic, but for me, I'd already spent so much time with traditional media, and I think there's something beautiful about it because um, art to me is still about objects. I'm interested in the virtual world, but when it comes to making, there's a physical relationship that one has with paint or clay that reminds us of our humanity. And I do as little digital work as possible in the books to try and keep those qualities, which actually include a kind of imperfection. So sometimes you're painting and it looks too good, and you have to sort of, ruin it a little bit because it's more human that way. Um, and so you can see there's a lot of scrape marks and things in my book, and that's really just trying to connect with the audience. It's almost like when a kid looks at my books, I want them to think on some level, I could make this book. I could have done this. I can see it's just colored mud on fabric. It's nothing special or highly polished. So I love the simplicity of that. And it's interesting you mentioned the kids' questions because as you were talking, the one question that always stuck in my mind that a kid asked me was like, if you're so good at painting and drawing, why aren't you a real artist? And the teacher who was there, she immediately said, "Oh, that's such a rude question." And I said, "No, it's a very good question. That's a really good question." And then I just explained to him that I didn't really see any difference between what someone does in a book or what someone does in a gallery, and that it didn't really matter to me. It was just about connecting to an audience, and that there's good and bad art in all different institutions. Um, and so, yeah, and it's basically just trying to find out the medium that works for you. And for me, I mean, I'm as surprised as anybody that I ended up working in picture books because I didn't really have much interest in picture books when I was an art student at all. And I was very dismissive of them. But as I've worked with them over the years, they just suit me, they just suit my temperament and my voice. I'm talking to you because my work was published. You wouldn't know about it if I was just exhibiting in galleries in Western Australia. So
Probably
um,
not.
it's a great vehicle for actually engaging with a broad audience and people who are very different from myself.
Talking about mediums, maybe a last question. Since my background is film, 10 years ago you made a film, you got an Academy Award for it. Was there ever after this the idea to put some of your art into film again? I mean, it is a huge success. Is there a story? Was it the one-time thing and it's enough? You don't want to repeat it? Or has there ever been someone knocking at your door asking for the rights of your characters, or you thinking about going back, repeating that, or even doing a feature film?
Uh, yeah, I think the story of that film's quite a long one, and I won't go into it, but it was a bit of an anomaly for me. So um, the fact that it was so successful is also a bit of an anomaly. And it does create a slight problem with a follow-up work. So I could just sort of say, well, I'm just going to quit while I'm ahead. But the truth is, there's been a lot of interest in developing my work for film. Um, I'm a little particular about it, so there's never quite been a good fit. Um, at the moment, there's been quite a bit of development of ideas for The Arrival as actually a television series, and that's after years and years of discussion with different studios about developing it as a feature film. The idea of turning it into a series has been the one step that seems to have unlocked it creatively from the problem of um, funding and things like that, and creative freedom. Because I've always wanted to produce a work that's, I guess you would call, art house, for want of a better term, and typically film companies had wanted to produce a work that's very popular, and I've never really been interested in being hugely popular. I just want things to be good. And it's unfortunate that the really good ideas are not always the popular ones. So um, it's been a constant dilemma. It's incredibly difficult, as you know, to get films made and made well. It's almost like a miracle if a good film gets made, I think. And so my time for me is better spent at the drawing table. You know, this I know after much experience. I mean, even after doing the Lost Thing film and that being so successful and loved, I still prefer the book a little bit, and I don't know why, because the film is such a wonderful piece of work, but because of the animators that worked on it, but there's something just so a bit rough and crude about the book that I just find appealing. I'm perfectly happy for the work to be adapted, but I just want to make sure that it's done right, and that does slow down the process quite a bit.
And we look forward to welcoming you in Berlin with a new project in 2021. If this is all over, you know what I'm talking about. And will you be inspired by the bleak landscape of the Berlin architecture to do maybe another project?
Oh yes, I'd love to return to Berlin and look at not just bleak architecture but beautiful architecture, which I also saw there as well. Um, and also just the I was fascinated by a lot of the underground comics culture there, and that real just very dynamic electric kind of undergrowth of stuff that as an outsider I just could not define, which got me quite excited, and I think my trip there was a little bit too short. But yeah, I'd love to return if things come back to normal, and um, yeah, the German graphic novel culture is also um, fantastic, and the children's literature culture, and the level of esteem that's also given to your creators of books for young people is very inspiring, and a great example for people here in Australia. So it'd be great to continue having a little bit more cultural exchange.
I was also aiming at knowing if you have a new project that you will present. Is there something in the pipeline?
Sadly not. I mean, there's stuff in the pipeline, but there's so far in the pipeline that I think you're going to need a kind of a oil pipeline before it comes out. Um, I guess uh, yeah. Unfortunately, nothing immediately to to hand, but yeah, I do have an idea for another book, which is um, without going into too much detail, the idea of a missionary trying to rescue someone who doesn't really want to be rescued. Um, and that's a I've been sort of increasingly interested in ideas of faith and religion and how they relate to um, individual creative expression. So that's sort of quite a different subject, but one that I'm interested in exploring. But the pandemic has actually, it's funny because my normal life as a creative artist is lockdown. You know, it's not so different. But it has slowed things down quite a bit. I think this is true for everybody, in ways that you don't expect. So right now, most of my time is
like this festival as well.
yeah, yeah. And right now, I'm my principal occupation is a school teacher. So um, so that's where a lot of my time and my wife's time is being spent. But it'll be interesting to also just to see how this period in time actually is reflected in everybody's creative work. For myself, I know it'll be quite a lag. Like I'll only be able to digest it 5 years down the track. But yeah, certainly it's like a kind of reality shift that has always intrigued me. So it's kind of fascinating, if a bit demoralizing, to be living in this time.
I think we all hope it will be over soon, that we will have a proper festival again, that you write more books, and in the meantime, if we're locked down, we still are lucky enough to be able to have your literature and the literature of many others at this festival. Thank you so much, Shaun Tan, to be talking to us to this festival. Thank you very much to everyone outside there, wherever you are, whoever you are, from whatever device you're watching and listening. I hope to see you soon in Berlin. Shaun Tan, thank you so much, and thanks to the festival for making this possible. Bye-bye.